Old black woman, Martha Cole, had spent her entire life saving every penny for medical treatment. But just as she withdrew her money from the bank, two corrupt cops robbed her under the guise of confiscating suspicious assets. Desperate, she had no choice but to call her only son, Elijah Cole, a Green Beret. The moment he heard his mother's voice, Elijah knew this wasn't just a robbery. It was a fight against a rotten system. His arrival in Atlanta made the entire police department regret their actions. What did Elijah do to bring them down? Did Atlanta truly change? Stay until the end to uncover the truth. If you find this story meaningful, hit like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next gripping tale of justice. That afternoon, the sky over Atlanta hung heavy with dark clouds, as if a raging storm could break loose at any moment. The thick, stifling air pressed down like an invisible weight on Martha Cole's frail shoulders. An elderly black woman, thin and worn by time, her silver-white hair stretched like delicate threads across a face etched deep with hardship. As she stepped out of the Wells Fargo bank, her hands trembled slightly, clutching a faded cloth bag against her chest. Inside, it lay everything she had left, her last thread of hope in a life full of struggles. $4,200 in cash, a sum painstakingly saved, dime by dime, over the years for one purpose, a long-overdue heart surgery. Life had never been kind to Martha, especially as she approached 70. Her husband had died when their only son, Elijah, was still a child, leaving her alone to shoulder the burdens of survival. For decades, she had worked tirelessly, rarely sparing a single dollar for herself. Every cent was set aside because she knew her heart was failing a little more each day. The cruel disease had drained her strength, making every step a struggle, every breath shorter. But she never stopped fighting, not when she still had Elijah. He had grown up and left to serve his country in the military, far from her reach, but never from her heart. He was the reason she endured, the reason she fought for each precious breath. After endless delays due to a lack of funds, the hospital had finally scheduled her surgery for the following week. This time, she had just enough to save her own life. The thought of living a little longer, of spending peaceful days with her son, gave her the strength to keep moving forward. But as Martha turned into a narrow alleyway, where few people passed, an ominous feeling crept over her. The sharp screech of tires tore through the silence, slicing the air like a blade. A police car came barreling toward her. She froze. Her frail heart, already fragile and unsteady, pounded wildly, stealing the breath from her lungs. A suffocating sense of dread wrapped around her like an invisible net, tightening, trapping. The vehicle skidded to a stop right in front of her, its engine roaring, taunting, mocking the cruel fate of a woman who had already endured more than enough. The car door swung open, and two police officers stepped out. One of them, Travis Greggs, tall, broad-shouldered, with a smug expression plastered across his face and eyes as cold as steel, strode directly toward Martha, chin raised in a challenge. On the other side, Ethan O'Reilly leaned against the squad car, his lanky frame relaxed, but his eyes darting around, scanning like a predator, ensuring its prey had nowhere to run. Greggs came to a stop in front of Martha, his lips curling into a disdainful smirk. Martha steadied herself, lifting her gaze to meet his. "Old lady, you just withdrew a large sum of money, didn't you?" His voice carried both mockery and menace. Martha took a small step back, her frail hands clutching the worn-out cloth bag even tighter, her voice measured but firm. "This is my money. I saved it for heart surgery." Greggs let out a sharp, derisive laugh, cutting her off. His eyes gleamed with amusement at the mention of her illness. Heart surgery? And where does an old black woman like you get this much cash? Looks mighty suspicious to me. Panic flared in Martha's eyes. She tried again, desperation making her voice tremble. No, it's mine. I worked for years to save every cent of it. But Greggs wasn't listening. He never intended to. His expression darkened with an aggressive gleam as he suddenly yanked the bag from her hands, the sheer force of it nearly knocking her off balance. He held the bag up with the air of a man acting under the guise of authority, when in reality he was nothing more than a thief. The law allows us to confiscate suspicious cash if there's reason to believe it's connected to criminal activity. This is called civil asset forfeiture, he said, spitting out the legal term as if it justified his actions. Greggs knew full well that Martha had no means to fight back, no way to challenge him. Her face crumpled in shock, her head shaking frantically as she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. But I've done nothing wrong. I can prove this money is mine. Greggs shrugged, his expression cold, devoid of sympathy. Prove it? I don't believe a damn word from someone like you. Then, with deliberate cruelty, he pulled out a few crumpled bills from the bag, crushed them in his fist, and tossed them to the ground at her feet, his voice dripping with mock kindness. There. I'm feeling generous today. That should be enough for you to buy yourself a coffin. Consider it charity. Behind him, O'Reilly let out a low chuckle, smirking as he added with a sneer, You should be thanking us, lady. We're protecting society from people like you. Think just 'cause you got cash in hand you can do whatever you want. With that, the squad car spun around and sped off, leaving Martha behind, small, frail, crumpled on the freezing pavement. Around her, the torn and discarded bills fluttered in the wind like worthless dead leaves. No one stepped forward to help. Her hand shook as she reached for her phone. Her fingers trembled over the screen as she dialed a number she had sworn never to call. Never to disturb her son while he was out there, fighting in some distant land, where bullets and bombs waited to claim him. But tonight, she had no choice. The phone rang. When the line clicked open, the first tear finally fell, and her voice broke into a sob. Elijah, I need you. Thousands of miles away from Atlanta, under the blistering sun of the Middle East, Elijah Cole sat in the back of a military transport truck, dust clinging to his uniform as the vehicle rumbled across the endless desert. It was his last mission here, the final stretch before returning home. He sat in silence, his sharp eyes fixed on the distant horizon. War had taught him a vital lesson, the art of staying calm in the eye of the storm, of controlling himself even when the world crumbled around him. Methodically, he pulled off his dust-covered gloves, folded them neatly, and tucked them into his pocket. The steady hum of the engine was suddenly interrupted by the sharp vibration of his phone. Elijah glanced down, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the caller ID. His mother. Martha never called him at this hour, which meant something was very, very wrong. "Mom?" He answered, his voice steady, but a deep unease had already begun to take hold. "Elijah, I need you." Her voice was weak, trembling, filled with a kind of despair and helplessness he had never heard from her before. His jaw tightened, veins tensing beneath the rough skin of his forearm as he gripped the phone. "What happened?" His voice dropped lower, firmer, as if he could will strength into her through the phone. "They took everything, Elijah. Every last dollar I saved for my heart surgery. They stole it right in front of me, and no one dared to stop them. Her voice cracked with pain and humiliation. Elijah clenched his teeth, his already cold gaze hardening further as rage surged within him like a tidal wave. But he didn't let it consume him. Instead, his mind shifted into the mode that had been drilled into him for years, analyzing, calculating, preparing for action. "Who did this, Mom? Who took your money?" he asked, each word forced through gritted teeth. There was a brief silence before Martha's hesitant whisper reached his ears. "The police, 2 officers. They said I couldn't possibly have that much money, and then they just took it. They claimed it was illegal." The word police froze the fury in Elijah for just a second. Then it returned, sharper, more controlled, more dangerous. He inhaled deeply, his grip tightening around the phone to the point where the plastic casing creaked under the pressure. This fight wasn't in some war-torn desert halfway across the world. It was back home, in the place he had believed his mother would be safe. Elijah's gaze flicked to his squad mates sitting ahead of him. He gave a single curt nod, a silent confirmation of what he had to do, before turning back to the phone. "Don't worry, Mom. I'm coming home." He ended the call. For a long moment, he didn't move. He focused on steadying his breathing, forcing himself into a state of clarity. Thoughts raced through his mind like the pieces of a battlefield strategy snapping into place. The enemy this time wasn't insurgents with rifles. It was something far worse, men who hid behind the law, using it as a shield to prey on the weak. The truck came to a halt, its tires grinding into the sand. Without hesitation, Elijah stood, leapt down, and strode straight toward the command tent. Inside, a young officer sat at a desk, his fingers tapping against a keyboard. Elijah wasted no time. "My mission here is complete. I'm requesting immediate leave. It's a family emergency." The officer glanced up, hearing the steel in Elijah's voice. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and started working on the request. Minutes passed. Elijah sat, his body still, but his mind a raging storm. He wasn't thinking about the desert anymore. He was thinking about that small old house in Atlanta where his mother sat alone, stripped of her dignity, and left with nothing. The officer returned. "Your flight leaves in 2 hours, Sergeant Cole." Elijah gave a short nod, stood, and left without another word. This wasn't just about getting the money back. This was bigger than that. He was walking into a battlefield where the corruption ran deep, where men like Travis Greggs and Ethan O'Reilly operated without fear of consequences. They thought they were untouchable. They thought no one would come for them. They were wrong. As Elijah gathered his things, he barely spared a glance at his packed gear. None of it mattered. This trip wasn't a homecoming. It was a mission. A mission to hunt down the filth that had crossed a line they never should have. He caught a glimpse of himself in the small mirror hanging on the wall. His own reflection stared back at him, calm, unwavering, deadly. There was no distance too great, no obstacle too high. He was coming for them. The real predator was about to return home, and Atlanta was about to learn a lesson. Some men never back down, especially when the fight is for the ones they love. The moment Elijah Cole stepped off the plane at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, he wasted no time on rest or reunions. His mind fixated on one single objective: learning everything about the man who had pushed his mother into despair. Elijah knew that to win any battle, he had to understand his enemy better than the enemy understood himself. And this time, the enemy was Travis Greggs, the officer who had stolen not just his mother's money, but her last hope for survival. the woman Elijah valued more than his own life. Elijah rented a small room in the outskirts of Atlanta, just secluded enough to work unnoticed. Late into the night, under the dim glow of his laptop screen, he combed through every scrap of information he could find on Greggs. The deeper he dug, the clearer a terrifying truth became. Travis Greggs wasn't just a greedy cop. Beneath the uniform, he was a man consumed by hatred, a ticking time bomb waiting for any excuse to unleash his festering rage. The official police records were deceptively clean. Greggs, 38 years old, had served over a decade in the Atlanta Police Department without a single formal disciplinary action. But Elijah knew better than to trust a spotless record. He had worked within military and law enforcement systems long enough to understand how they protected men like Greggs from public scrutiny. Through old contacts, he tapped into a reliable inside source, and what he found only solidified his resolve. Greggs had been investigated at least 3 times for excessive use of force, his targets, without exception, black civilians. Any of these incidents should have ended his career. Yet each time, the cases had been mysteriously dismissed due to lack of evidence. The most egregious case involved Greggs beating an unarmed black teenager unconscious in broad daylight for allegedly looking at him the wrong way. Public outrage had erupted, but the storm was quickly buried under legal loopholes and bureaucratic silence. The more Elijah read, the more a pattern emerged. Greggs didn't just target people of color, he preyed on those least able to fight back. One detail stood out. Years ago, Greggs had applied for the city's SWAT team, but was eliminated in the preliminary trials. His file noted deficiencies in both physical endurance and tactical skills. An outright failure. But what made Greggs dangerous wasn't his rejection. It was how he reacted to it. He convinced himself that he wasn't cut because of his shortcomings, but because of them. Minority applicants, particularly military veterans like Elijah, who benefited from diversity initiatives. That belief festered inside him, twisting his arrogance into something darker. He became more than just a corrupt cop. He became a man driven by resentment, a grudge that grew with every perceived injustice. To him, men like Elijah were a humiliation, a reminder that he had never been good enough. Elijah leaned back in his chair, inhaling slowly as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Greggs wasn't just a thief who had stolen from his mother. He was the embodiment of a rotten system, a man who saw justice not as a duty to uphold, but as a tool to control, punish, and oppress those he deemed inferior. His cruelty wasn't random. It was calculated, deliberate, and fueled by years of deep-seated rage. Outside the window, the night thickened into the first traces of dawn. Elijah knew this wouldn't be an easy fight. He had faced ruthless enemies on the battlefield, but taking down a corrupt officer protected by the very institution meant to hold him accountable? That was an entirely different war. He closed his laptop, his gaze shifting to an old photograph on the table. His mother, smiling, warm and full of life. Her suffering wouldn't be in vain, and Travis Greggs would soon understand that some men do not forgive. Travis Greggs, Elijah murmured, his voice low and ice-cold. Your time has come. Beyond the window, the first rays of sunlight broke through the thin curtains, but Elijah had no time to savor the morning's peace. The hunt had begun, and this time the predator would become the prey. As the first rays of morning sunlight crept through the window, Elijah Cole had already finalized his plan for the battle ahead. After years of facing danger on brutal battlefields, he understood that this fight would be different. not against distant enemies in a foreign land, but against those who wielded the law as a weapon in the heart of Atlanta. Before stepping out of his room, he took one last glance at his mother's photograph and silently vowed, "Don't worry, Mom. They will pay for what they've done." Elijah left the small apartment and headed straight for Zone 3 Police Precinct, the den of Travis Greggs and Ethan O'Reilly. The moment he stepped into the station's front lobby, the once busy atmosphere thickened instantly. Conversations quieted, heads turned. Eyes filled with curiosity, skepticism, and restrained excitement fixated on the unfamiliar man who had just entered. Elijah walked up to the front desk, his demeanor calm, yet unwavering. His voice carried through the station, clear and firm. "I want to see Travis Greggs." The receptionist flinched, eyes darting around nervously. But Elijah didn't need to repeat himself. Almost immediately, the door to the back office swung open, and Travis Greggs emerged, a smug grin plastered across his face. He had been waiting for this moment, orchestrating it like a predator lying in wait. He moved with a slow, deliberate stride, exuding the confidence of a man who believed he was in control. "Specialist Cole, you finally made it!" Greggs taunted, his voice dripping with amusement, as if they were old acquaintances. There was a glint of satisfaction in Greggs' eyes as he stopped a few steps away, arms crossed over his chest in a stance of arrogance and provocation. Elijah locked eyes with him and instantly knew. Greggs had done his homework. He didn't just know Elijah's name or face. He knew his history, his career, and most importantly, what had happened to Martha. "I have to admit, your military record is impressive," Greggs continued, his words laced with mockery. "Silver Star, that rescue mission in Syria. A real war hero, huh? Too bad this isn't the Middle East. This is Atlanta." Elijah understood immediately. Greggs had been digging into his past for some time. The way he mentioned the rescue mission, emphasizing it with a sneer, confirmed that Greggs wasn't just aware of Elijah's achievements, he intended to weaponize them. But what unsettled Elijah wasn't the mockery. It was the absolute confidence in Greggs's eyes, the certainty of a man who had already calculated every move Elijah would make. This wasn't a confrontation Greggs feared. It was one he had prepared for. Greggs smirked again, his voice dripping with disdain. "I heard your mother needed money for surgery." "Right. $4,200, wasn't it? She must be so proud, knowing her son is dumb enough to walk into a police station demanding it back." Elijah forced himself to remain still, his muscles coiled tight beneath his skin. Greggs's words were a deliberate poison, his tone dripping with contempt for Martha, designed to provoke Elijah into a reckless reaction. But Elijah refused to give Greggs what he wanted. He clenched his fist slightly, keeping his voice even as he replied, "I'm not here for your insults. Give my mother back what you stole, or the consequences will be severe." Greggs threw his head back and laughed, loud and exaggerated, making sure the entire station heard. His gaze flickered toward his fellow officers, as if reinforcing his dominance in the room. "You hear that? This guy thinks he makes the rules. Maybe the military spoiled you too much, huh, Cole? Now you think you can bring your battlefield justice into my station?" The officers around them murmured, some throwing suspicious glances at Elijah. Greggs had wasted no time twisting the narrative, turning public perception in his favor. He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough for Elijah to hear, though his words were still loud enough to carry to those nearby. "Listen closely, Cole. I know exactly what kind of man you are. a worthless black soldier who got a free pass because of some diversity quota. You think just because you carried a rifle in the Middle East, you can come back here and tell us how to do our jobs? This is Atlanta, and we are the law. Greggs had been setting this trap from the moment Elijah walked through the doors. This wasn't just an attempt to intimidate him, it was a carefully calculated move to destroy him in the worst possible way. He didn't just want Elijah to lose control, he wanted to turn him into a symbol of everything society already feared: a violent black man, a thug who attacked the police, a justification for the very prejudices that men like Greggs thrived on. For him, this wasn't just about getting rid of Elijah, it was about proving his warped beliefs about power and order. If Elijah snapped and struck first, Greggs would have all the justification he needed to order an immediate arrest. A Green Beret assaulting an officer right in the middle of Zone 3 police precinct? The headlines would write themselves. The narrative would be twisted and spread like wildfire, painting Elijah as a criminal in the public eye. Greggs knew that image was everything. He had seen it happen before. Black men lured into confrontations with the police, only to have the media reduce them to troublemakers, threats to public safety. A carefully edited video clip showing nothing but Elijah throwing a punch, without any of the context leading up to it, would be enough to ignite public outrage in exactly the direction Greggs wanted. And Greggs hadn't chosen this battleground by accident. He wanted an audience, his fellow officers, the ones who had spent years covering for each other, men who would have no problem writing a false report if it meant protecting one of their own. If Elijah got arrested, they would testify that he had been the aggressor, that he had threatened law enforcement. Greggs even had a backup plan in case things escalated too far. He could always claim self-defense. After all, he was dealing with a trained soldier, a Green Beret skilled in combat. That label would be twisted against Elijah, turning him into a dangerous, uncontrollable weapon, rather than a man seeking justice. But above all, Greggs wanted to make this personal. He wanted to send a message, not just to Elijah, but to the entire black community. No matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they achieved, no matter if they became soldiers or heroes, men like him would always be in control. This wasn't just about physically beating Elijah. It was about crushing his very image in the public eye. Greggs wanted Elijah to become living proof of his own hateful ideology, that black men couldn't control their anger, that they would always turn to violence, that they were never victims, only perpetrators. Elijah stared into Greggs's eyes, seeing through every inch of the trap he had laid out. He could feel the weight of the gazes around him, watching his every move, waiting for him to slip. If he so much as raised a hand, it would all be over. His mother's suffering would be lost in the noise, and he would become exactly what Greggs wanted him to be. From deep within, Elijah knew that to win this fight for justice, he couldn't fall into Greggs' trap so easily. Elijah stepped out of Zone 3 police precinct, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. The rage still burned within him, but he knew he couldn't let it take control. Greggs had set a trap, carefully orchestrating a scenario that would back Elijah into a corner with no way out. But Elijah wasn't the kind of man to fall into a trap so easily. He had fought on battlefields where a single misstep could mean the death of an entire team. He understood the importance of patience. Darkness had begun swallowing the streets of Atlanta as he walked, his mind running through every possible move. He needed a plan. He needed information. He needed a way to strike at the very system Greggs relied on for protection. At that moment, a black car pulled up beside him. The window rolled down and a low voice spoke. "Get in, Cole." Elijah glanced inside. It was Lieutenant Marcus Carter. But unlike the others in that precinct, Carter was one of the few who still had integrity in this rotten system. Elijah had heard of him even back in the military, a man who hadn't been corrupted, someone trying to change things from the inside, despite knowing he was fighting in a swamp of filth. Elijah hesitated for only a moment before opening the door and stepping in. Carter didn't speak immediately. He drove through the quiet streets, the glow of streetlights casting blurred streaks of gold against the windows. Only when they reached an empty parking lot did he stop the car, kill the engine, and turn to face Elijah. "I know what happened to your mother," Carter began, his voice heavy with the weight of knowledge. "And I know you're not the kind of man to sit back and let it go." Elijah leaned back in his seat, arms crossed over his chest. "Good. Then cut to the chase, Carter. What do you want?" Carter exhaled, his expression a mix of caution and sincerity. "I want you to stay smart." He paused before continuing. "I know Greggs and O'Reilly are scum, but they aren't just rogue cops. They have an entire system protecting them. If you want to win, you have to fight on your own terms." Elijah narrowed his eyes. "A system?" Carter nodded. "Greggs isn't just some dirty cop. He's connected to people with real power, the ones who've been covering for him all these years. He's not just a thug who robbed an old woman on the street. He's part of something much bigger." Elijah remained silent, letting the pieces fall into place in his mind. Carter leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "There's something else. Greggs isn't planning to let you take this any further. He knows you won't stop, so he's hiring people to take you out before you get the chance." Elijah wasn't surprised. He had seen this kind of play before, back in the war. Men like Greggs never fought head-on when they could strike from the shadows. But one detail stood out. "Hiring people? Who?" Carter gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "A team of professionals. Not street-level enforcers. Greggs knows who you are, knows how you've been trained, so he's not sending amateurs. He wants you gone. Cleanly. An accident, a misunderstanding, or just a body no one will investigate." Elijah clenched his jaw but remained composed. "Good. That means he's afraid." Carter stared at him. "Don't you get it, Cole? This isn't just about getting your mother's money back anymore. This is a war." Elijah took a slow breath, his eyes drifting to the streets of Atlanta beyond the windshield. Carter was right. This was no longer just about justice. It was about taking on a system that would kill to keep its power intact. Elijah turned back to Carter, his gaze resolute. "You're right. I can't play by Greg's rules, because his rules are designed to twist the truth. But if he thinks I'm going to let him walk away from this, he's dead wrong." Carter studied him for a long moment before letting out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "You're exactly like they say. You don't back down. And I'm not fighting alone." Carter raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Elijah didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the door, stepping out onto the pavement. He looked back at Carter one last time. "Greggs thinks he's the hunter, but I'm about to show him who the real predator is." Then he shut the door and walked away into the night. Carter watched him go, a chill creeping down his spine. The war had only just begun. Atlanta at night lay cloaked in silence, but beneath that deceptive calm, a war was about to erupt. Greggs was done waiting. He knew Elijah Cole was dangerous, not just because of his military training, but because of his relentless refusal to back down. He needed to deal with this problem quickly, decisively, before Elijah had the chance to strike back. Greggs didn't trust street thugs or low-level enforcers. He needed professionals. men who knew how to make problems disappear without leaving a trace, and he had called the right people. 5 men sat inside an unmarked black SUV, parked just one street away from Elijah's apartment. They didn't talk much, just checked their weapons, exchanged nods, and waited for the signal. This wasn't their first job. Accidents, disappearances, bodies never found. This was routine work for them. The leader, known only as Vance, was an ex-mercenary, a man who had once operated in the Middle East before returning to the U.S. to do cleanup work for those with power. He lifted his radio, his voice a low growl. "The target's a Special Forces operative. Not easy, but not impossible. Quick, clean, leave no traces." The other 4 nodded and moved out, spreading through the neighborhood to surround Elijah's apartment. But just as they entered the block, the entire street went dark. Every light vanished. The street lamps, the windows, even the neon glow of nearby signs, all snuffed out in an instant. The alleyways became voids of pure blackness. Inside the SUV, Vance stiffened, eyes scanning the street. What the hell? They had scouted this area before the job. There were no signs of electrical malfunctions. This wasn't an accident. This was a signal, a warning. A shadow flickered past them, too fast to track, and then a scream. Vance spun around, but one of his men had already vanished into the darkness. No struggle, no gunfire. 1 second he was there, the next he was gone. The remaining men felt a chill creep down their spines. "Shit. He's hunting us," one of them whispered, gripping his gun tighter, his hands trembling despite himself. Vance's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "Spread out. Don't let him box us in." But before they could react, another scream cut through the silence. Another man gone. No sign of Elijah, no sound of a fight. Only the overwhelming presence of something unseen, something lurking in the darkness. These men were used to being the predators. But tonight, they weren't the hunters. They were the hunted. The suffocating blackness, the absolute silence, the knowledge that someone was watching them from every shadow. It gnawed at their nerves. "Shoot! Just shoot!" one of them screamed, losing all control. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the empty streets. But they weren't shooting at an enemy. They were firing blindly into the void, at the fear tightening around their throats. Vance gritted his teeth, his instincts screaming at him. He had made a grave mistake. This wasn't an assassination. It was urban guerrilla warfare. Elijah wasn't running. He was using the city itself as his battleground, isolating them, picking them off one by one. Vance grabbed his radio, desperation creeping into his voice as he reached out to Greggs, who was monitoring from a nearby safe house. "We've got a problem! This guy isn't running! He's hunting us!" For the first time, Greggs's voice came back with a hint of genuine fear. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if you thought he'd run like a scared little bitch, you were dead wrong. He's turned this whole block into a goddamn war zone. I've lost 2 men and we haven't even seen his face." Greggs clenched his jaw, fingers tightening around his phone. The plan was unraveling. Elijah wasn't just resisting. He was controlling the battlefield. Vance panted, his back pressed against an old brick wall, his eyes darting through the shadows. The darkness was too deep. The silence was too thick. Only his own ragged breathing filled the empty space around him. Then, a whisper, ice cold, right at his ear. "You hear that?" Before he could turn, an iron grip locked around his throat and dragged him into the abyss. The streetlights flickered back to life 5 minutes later. The few survivors, barely a handful, stood shaking in the middle of the street, weapons scattered uselessly at their feet. Some had been bound to lampposts, their mouths stuffed with rags, eyes wide in terror. Vance lay sprawled on the pavement, unconscious, his face swollen from a single crushing blow. And on the brick wall opposite, written in the blood of one of the mercenaries, was a single sentence: "I know who sent you." When Greggs received the call, his hands shook. For the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be prey. The night wind slithered through Atlanta's narrow alleyways, carrying the damp scent of aged brick and decay. Gregg stood rigid, his grip tightening around his Glock, his frantic eyes scanning every shadow. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the harsh rhythm of his own breathing. The assassins he had hired were gone. No traces, no cries for help, not even bodies. They had simply disappeared. Greggs had never felt this kind of powerlessness before. He had always been in control, a cop with untouchable authority, shielded by the system that ensured he faced no consequences. He was used to people bowing their heads, cowering before him. But this time, something had changed. A cold chill crawled up his spine as the realization settled in. He was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. Snatching his radio, he forced his voice to stay steady. "Vance, does anyone copy? Report now." Nothing but static. His pulse pounded as he spun on his heel, sprinting toward his patrol car. He had to get out, call for backup, regain control of the situation. But the moment he reached for the door, bang! The car door was ripped from its hinges as if a hurricane had torn through it. Gregg stumbled back, nearly falling to the ground, his eyes wide with shock. A figure stepped into the dim flicker of the streetlight. Elijah Cole emerged from the darkness, his face illuminated in cold, flickering light. No rage, no haste, just absolute control, like a predator savoring the final moments before the kill. "You like hunting people, don't you, Greggs?" Elijah's voice was low, sharp, slicing through the air like a blade. Greggs swallowed hard, his shaking hands lifting the gun, aiming straight at Elijah. "Back off! You have no right to do this!" Elijah took a slow step forward, unfazed. "I think you're the one with no right!" Greggs roared, pulling the trigger. Bang! The bullet whizzed through the air, but Elijah was gone. Silence. Gregg spun around wildly, his breath ragged, his eyes darting to every shadow. No one could move that fast. No one could. "You missed." The whisper came from right behind him. Before Greggs could turn, a fist like a sledgehammer slammed into his ribs. He cried out, staggering back, barely able to keep himself upright. The pain shot through his body like fire, but there was no time to recover before... Crack! A second blow struck his jaw, whipping his head back into the patrol car. Stars exploded in his vision as he gasped for air, sweat mixing with the cold terror sinking into his bones. He fumbled to raise the gun again, but a hand shot out, vice-like fingers locking around his wrist and twisting. Snap! Greggs howled in agony as his wrist wrenched at an unnatural angle. The gun tumbled from his grip, clattering onto the pavement. Before he could scream for help, a crushing force slammed him against the hood of his own car. Pinned, defenseless, overpowered. Elijah leaned in, his voice quiet, but each word laced with lethal intent. "How many people have you done this to, Greggs?" Greggs thrashed weakly, but Elijah tightened his grip, and for the first time in his life he felt his own spine creak under the pressure. "You really thought you'd never pay for it?" Greggs wheezed, panic clawing at his throat. This was fear, the real kind. Elijah reached inside his jacket. A flash of steel caught the dim streetlight as he pulled out a knife. The blade gleamed, wickedly sharp, its cold surface reflecting Greg's trembling face. The edge barely brushed his throat, not cutting, just a whisper of steel against skin. "What do you think I'm going to do next?" Greg swallowed hard, his lips trembling. "Please," he choked, his voice breaking. Elijah tilted his head slightly, as if considering the plea. Then, in an instant, he pulled back. Greggs gasped for breath, his lungs heaving as he blinked up in dazed confusion. Elijah bent down, picked up the fallen gun, ejected the magazine, and tossed both into the storm drain nearby. His gaze was cold, delivering a message clearer than any threat. "I'm not you, Greggs." Greg stared as Elijah turned and walked away, his figure melting into the night. For the first time in his life, Greggs knew. Every time he stepped into a dark alley, every time he heard a sound in the dead of night, every time he felt eyes watching him from the shadows, he would remember the name Elijah Cole. Greggs slumped onto the freezing pavement, his back pressed against the dented patrol car. His breath came in ragged, uneven gasps, his chest rising and falling like a drowning man who had barely managed to claw his way to the surface. But even though he had escaped Elijah's fists, he knew the nightmare wasn't over. The pain from the blows still pulsed through his ribs, but what truly made him tremble was Elijah's eyes, a gaze that needed no threats, no shouting, yet carved an irreversible fear into his mind. Elijah stood a few feet away, composed, unshaken by everything that had just happened. No explosive rage, no finishing blow, just a predator who knew his prey had already been conquered. Greg swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. But when Elijah calmly pulled his phone from his pocket, he realized it wasn't over. "You think this is finished, Greggs?" Elijah's voice was steady, but it carried the weight of a sentence already passed. Greggs didn't answer. What could he even say? "I don't need to kill you," Elijah continued, stepping closer. "I don't need to dirty my hands with a piece of shit like you. I just need the world to see you for what you really are." He activated the camera, angling it toward Greggs. "So now, start talking." Greg squinted, his breath hitching for a second before defiance flared in his eyes. "You're insane if you think I'll just destroy myself over some video," he spat out, forcing a hollow chuckle, grasping at the remnants of his confidence. But in an instant, Elijah crouched, his hand latching onto Greg's throat. Not hard enough to knock him out, but just enough to remind him of the razor-thin line between life and death. "Greggs, do you think I asked twice?" Greg's eyes bulged. He could feel Elijah's fingers pressing into his skin, each second tightening the noose around his windpipe. The fear that surged through him was suffocating, but it wasn't the pressure of Elijah's grip that was the worst. It was his eyes. This was a man who knew exactly what he was capable of, and if it came down to it, he wouldn't hesitate. Greggs thrashed weakly, but it was useless. His throat locked up, his vision swam as oxygen slipped away. Elijah's grip didn't waver, not even slightly. "You wanted to play power games, Greggs. Fine." Elijah lifted the phone higher, his voice unshaken. "What do you think happens if I upload this video?" Greggs clenched his teeth, still resisting. But after just 3 more seconds, the realization crashed over him. This wasn't a bluff. It could all end right here. A sharp strike to his collarbone forced a desperate, shuddering breath from his lungs. Elijah leaned in, his voice now a whisper that cut deeper than any scream. There won't be anywhere left for you. The police? They'll throw you under the bus to protect themselves. The criminals? They'll use you to burn down the whole department. And you think you can run? Trust me, Greggs, if I want to make you disappear, no one will ever find your body. Greg's mouth opened, but no words came. Look around, Elijah continued, his eyes sweeping the empty street. There's no one coming to help you. And believe me, I don't bluff. He loosened his grip, just enough for Greggs to collapse into a coughing fit, his lungs clawing for air like he had been dragged out of the abyss. You have two choices, Greggs, Elijah said. One, confess right now, in front of the camera. Or two, I tell this story my way, and trust me, you won't like how it ends. Greggs trembled, staring into the phone's lens. He knew he had lost. He knew there was no way out. His hands shook as he swallowed hard and finally began to speak. My name is Travis Greggs. I am an officer of the Atlanta Police Department, Zone 3. Elijah said nothing, just kept the camera steady, watching. I have abused my power. Greg's voice cracked. I stole money from an innocent woman. I fabricated charges to cover up my crimes. Every word felt like a knife slicing through his own throat. But he knew if he didn't say them, he wouldn't exist much longer. I also hired hitmen to kill Elijah Cole. Elijah tilted his head slightly, the ghost of a cold smile playing at the corner of his lips. Keep going, Greggs. Greggs clenched his jaw, closing his eyes like he was driving a blade into his own chest. I have used my badge to harm and destroy the lives of people I look down on. His fists clenched tightly. I didn't do it just for the money. I did it because I believe people like them, don't deserve the same rights as me. The moment Greg's confession was forced into the light, Atlanta ignited. The videos, the evidence, and the internal documents detailing his crimes flooded the internet, spreading at a relentless pace. Footage of Greg's brazenly robbing Martha Cole, audio recordings of him admitting to orchestrating harassment and violence against black citizens, and leaked reports showing how his investigations had always been swept under the rug. All of it was now public knowledge. The system that had shielded him for so long suddenly had no one left willing to protect him. Greggs became the face of corruption in the Atlanta Police Department. Reporters swarmed Zone 3 precinct, hounding his superiors for answers, forcing them to address the scandal. But worse than the media storm was the silent betrayal of his fellow officers. No one wanted to be associated with the man now branded as the city's disgrace. Greggs spiraled into panic. His power was gone. His safety net, gone. His name had become toxic, a stain on the department that everyone wanted to scrub away. He had once believed himself untouchable, a man above consequence. Now he was nothing but a discarded pawn, abandoned the moment he became a liability. He knew that if he stayed, the walls would close in, the investigations would come, the charges would stack up, and prison, the one place men like him never wanted to end up, would be inevitable. With no options left, Greggs resigned that very night. He didn't wait for termination. He didn't wait for a subpoena. He quietly packed his belongings and walked out of the precinct, his steps heavy under the weight of every stare that followed him. No one spoke to him. No one said goodbye. He wasn't a police officer anymore, just another man running from his sins. He drove out of Atlanta under the cover of darkness. No destination, no plan, just the desperate need to be anywhere but here before the walls caved in completely. But deep down, Greggs knew there was nowhere left for him to run. In a quiet corner of the city, Elijah sat on the old wooden porch of his mother's house. He wasn't surprised to see the news. Greg's resigning and fleeing had always been the inevitable outcome. Once the city turned against him, there had never been another path. But this wasn't the end of the fight. Greg's had been a symptom, not the disease. The system had protected him, nurtured him, enabled him to thrive for years. Atlanta could breathe a little easier with him gone, but if men like him still existed, still believed they could do the same without consequence, the cycle would never break. As the TV flickered with news segments dissecting Greg's downfall, across the city, Ethan O'Reilly sat in his dimly lit apartment, an empty liquor bottle rolling across the table. The collapse of the man who had once seemed untouchable was all over the news. Every channel, every article. Greg's, once arrogant, once untouchable, now nothing but a disgraced name, spoken with disgust. Greg's had run. A part of O'Reilly knew that was the only thing he could do. But another part of him, the part that made him break out in a cold sweat every night, knew something far worse. Greg's wasn't there to protect him anymore. O'Reilly had never been strong. He had never been the one to stand at the front of a fight. He had been a scavenger, circling behind predators, feeding off their leftovers. When Greg's had yanked the envelope of cash from Martha Cole's hands, O'Reilly had said nothing. When Greg shoved her to the ground, he had only watched. He had never committed the crime, but he had let it happen. And now he was realizing that silence had made him just as guilty. His phone vibrated, a number he didn't recognize. He didn't answer. The nightmare of that night still haunted him. The way Elijah Cole had walked into Zone 3, his presence alone enough to turn the unshakable Greg's into a broken man. The way he had unraveled everything, taken apart what should have been unbreakable. He remembered the call from Greg's that night, his voice, frantic, panicked, like a trapped animal realizing there was no way out. O'Reilly swallowed hard. Elijah hadn't killed Greg's, but that didn't mean Elijah would spare him. He shot up from his chair, moving to the window, peeling back the curtain just enough to glimpse the street below. The city moved as usual. Cars passed, street lights flickered. Nothing seemed out of place. But he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, out there in the shadows, someone was watching. It had been 3 days since Greg's vanished, and O'Reilly had never felt more on edge. At the precinct, no one spoke to him the way they used to. Colleagues who once exchanged nods of acknowledgement now avoided his gaze, as if he carried a curse. The unspoken respect, the silent approval he had once relied on, gone. Now, every time he entered a room, conversations died. He was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. The thought of running had crossed his mind more than once. He could pack up, leave Atlanta, start fresh somewhere else. But one thing stopped him. Greg's had run. And no one knew where he was. No one knew if he was even alive. O'Reilly refused to become the next Greg's. Instead, he chose to live in the shadows of his own fear. He called in sick, refusing to step foot in the station. He locked his doors, avoided all contact, distanced himself from anything that could pull him back into the spiral that had consumed Greg's. But fear wasn't something that could be locked away behind 4 walls. It seeped into his mind, waking him in the middle of the night, his back drenched in cold sweat. He dreamed of being dragged into a dark alley, unseen hands tightening around his throat, and when he looked up, Elijah Cole was there. Not with rage, not with hatred, just the silent, unshakable stare of a man who could not be stopped. He began avoiding the streets he once patrolled. He switched grocery stores, found new bars, changed his routines. But still, no matter how much he tried to escape the feeling, he knew. One day, Elijah would come for him. Time passed, and to the world, things seemed to settle. But for O'Reilly, peace would never return. No one knocked on his door. No threatening calls came. No one followed him, at least not in a way he could prove. But he knew. He knew. Elijah was still out there, watching, waiting. And if O'Reilly ever made a wrong move, took one misstep back into his old ways, he would return. The news of Greg's downfall and his mysterious disappearance spread like wildfire through Zone 3 and across Atlanta. The officers who had once thrived under the same corrupt system now found themselves holding their breath. No one knew where Greg's had gone. No one knew if he was even alive. And that uncertainty terrified them more than any trial or indictment ever could. On a cold gray morning, as the officers of Zone 3 arrived for work as usual, an unmarked brown envelope sat on the captain's desk. No one saw who had placed it there. No one knew where it had come from. Inside a single sheet of paper. "If you keep doing what Greg's did, I will come back." No fingerprints, no evidence, but the message was louder than anything else. For years, Zone 3 had operated under the assumption that there were no consequences, that officers like Greg's and O'Reilly could do as they pleased, shielded by the system that had always protected them. But now, for the first time, the untouchables knew fear. The atmosphere in the station grew tense, heavy with a weight they had never felt before. The officers who once laughed at victims like Martha Cole no longer found humor in their cruelty. No one dared to speak of Greg's, but his name hung in the air like a warning. No one wanted to be the next to disappear into the night. Lieutenant Marcus Carter watched in silence. He didn't know if Elijah had left the note himself, but he understood one thing. Whether the message had been delivered in words or in fear, its meaning had taken root. Those who abused their power would now think twice before laying a hand on the innocent. Carter picked up the note, reading it again, his expression unreadable. This wasn't justice in the traditional sense, but in a city where the system was still riddled with rot, sometimes justice needed a steel hand to clear the way before anything new could be built. In a narrow alleyway a few blocks away, a group of officers, ones familiar with dirty work, gathered in hushed voices, their fear visible in their eyes. One of them, Morales, slammed his fist onto the table, his voice tense with frustration. "What the hell are we supposed to do? Greg's is gone. O'Reilly's hiding like a rat in the sewers. I'm not about to end up like them." Another officer, Foster, growled, "Calm down. This could just be some scare tactic. We don't know for sure that Elijah Cole is behind all of this." Morales let out a bitter laugh. "You actually believe that? Who the hell else could have done this? Everyone in this department knew what Greg's was up to, but only he was targeted. And those hitmen Greg's hired? They didn't just disappear by accident." The air in the room grew suffocating. No one wanted to admit what they were all thinking. Elijah Cole wasn't someone they could handle. He wasn't some street thug they could beat down and bury under fabricated charges. He was a soldier, a man who had fought in real wars. And more importantly, he wasn't reckless. He chose his targets. Foster swallowed hard and spoke slowly. "We have only one option. Lay low. Keep our heads down. No trouble. Nothing that puts us on his radar." Morales clenched his fists, his pride seething, but he knew there was no alternative. They couldn't win against someone like Elijah. He didn't play by their rules, and that made him more dangerous than any enemy they had ever faced. For the first time, they understood. They were no longer the ones in control. Meanwhile, Elijah Cole stood on the rooftop of an old building, silently watching the city stretch out before him. The streetlights flickered below, the roads still bustling as if nothing had changed. But he knew better. Something had shifted. Greggs was gone. O'Reilly was too scared to show his face. And the rest of them, though not entirely crushed, were forced to hesitate. Even if he returned to the military, they would always be looking over their shoulders. Atlanta had changed. The night was unnaturally quiet. No wailing sirens, no drunken laughter from men who believed they were untouchable. The city continued to move. The world kept turning, but the shadows that had once loomed over certain streets had begun to thin. Elijah Cole stepped through the creaking wooden door of the house he grew up in, the sound of its hinges echoing softly in the stillness of the night. The warm scent of cinnamon and herbal tea drifted from the small kitchen, wrapping the air in a comforting familiarity he hadn't felt in years. Martha Cole sat at the table, her frail hands resting lightly on the worn wooden surface. Her eyes never left her son. Elijah placed an envelope in front of her. No words were needed, no explanations. The weight of it spoke for itself. The money she had lost, every last dollar, had been returned. Martha stared at the envelope, then looked up at her son. Her expression held not just surprise, but something deeper, understanding, concern. A mother's quiet wisdom that came from witnessing too much of the world's cruelty. Her voice was soft, but firm. "What did you do to get this back?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked at his mother, the woman who had worked herself to the bone to raise him, the woman who had never once bowed to hardship. He knew she wasn't naive. She wasn't the type to accept pretty lies. But there were some truths better left unknown. He smiled, small but genuine. "You don't want to know." Martha exhaled, not pressing further. She already knew the answer, in the way only a mother could. There was relief in her eyes, but also worry, an unspoken acceptance that justice didn't always come from courtrooms or badges, but from those willing to do what was necessary. Elijah sat across from her, his hands clasped together. They said nothing more. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was the silence of understanding. Martha's surgery went ahead as scheduled. Elijah spent hours in the hospital hallway, elbows on his knees, eyes locked onto the glowing light above the operating room doors. He had never been the kind of man to believe in fate or gods, but this time he found himself praying, something he hadn't done since he was a child. Finally, the doctor stepped out, pulling down his mask, a reassuring smile on his face. The surgery had been a success. Elijah closed his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to relax, just a little. Not because men like Greggs had disappeared, not because he had sent a message to Zone 3, but because the one person in the world who could still make him feel like a child, his mother, was going to live. He stepped into the hospital room where Martha lay, her eyes still heavy with exhaustion, but her lips curled into a soft smile the moment she saw him. Elijah sat down beside her, gently taking her hand in his. "I'm here." Martha didn't say a word. She simply squeezed his hand, her way of telling him she knew, that she didn't need to worry anymore. In the weeks that followed, life slowly settled into a new rhythm. one that wasn't entirely the same as before, but one that Elijah could accept. He stayed by his mother's side, helping her recover, taking slow walks with her through their quiet little neighborhood, which now felt just a bit more peaceful than before. He knew that men like Greg's would eventually be replaced by others, that the world would never truly be rid of those who abused their power. But he also knew that sometimes even the smallest action could tip the scales. Rumors of Greg's downfall and the mysterious warning letter continued to spread. No one could say for certain that Elijah was behind it all, but everyone understood. Things had changed. The old order had been broken. The officers who once laughed as they bent the law to their will were no longer so bold. And Atlanta, while still far from perfect, had shifted, if only a little. One quiet evening, Elijah sat on the porch, watching the street in front of him. Martha walked out with 2 cups of herbal tea, setting one in front of him before settling into the chair beside him. "Do you think they'll come back?" Elijah took a sip of his tea, letting the warmth spread through him. He looked at his mother, then back at the street, at the golden glow spilling from small windows, at the people who could now go about their lives without bowing their heads to men like Greg's. He smiled faintly, setting his cup down. "Number, they know better now." Martha nodded, satisfied with his answer. She didn't know exactly what Elijah had done, but she knew one thing: he was still here, and for her, that was enough. Elijah Cole's story wasn't just about reclaiming justice for his mother. It was a warning to those who thrived on unchecked power. A man who once only sought to protect his family had become the nightmare of those who believed they were untouchable. The fall of Greg's and the ghost that now haunted O'Reilly had changed Atlanta in ways no one could have predicted. But the real question remained: had justice truly been restored, or would others rise to take Greg's place, continuing the cycle of corruption? What do you think Elijah should do next? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this story meaningful, hit like to spread the message, share so more people can hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.